Good morning.
Good morning.
So we've been looking at the rearing of the temple, and in our consideration of the subject, we see that the end of the foundation, the history of the foundations, we've been identifying as taking place in 2014. Then we come to the prediction before midnight, where we have laid out a number of lines, just a few lines, which teach us about the things that are going to take place when we come to this Weimar. So our last study was seeking to clarify the relationship between 2014 and the prediction before midnight. And we saw from the 30 years of Christ that John the Baptist is raised up half a year before Christ begins his ministry at midnight. And he's raised up giving a prediction about the close of probation on the Jewish nation and the coming of the Romans to destroy the temple. This prediction is typifying the prediction that takes place here. From the 30 years of Abraham's covenant, we see that Abraham received the covenant promise. We showed how this is marking 9/11 as Abraham was making his way out of Ur, the Chaldees, and then from Haran. Terah, his father, dying in Haran. Terah is a symbol of the leadership of Adventism, and Terah was an idolater. Right? So we see that being typified at 9/11 when the leadership is passed by because of idolatry and spiritualism. 25 years later, or rather, when Abraham is 86 years old, Ishmael is born, and then subsequent to that, Isaac is born 25 years later. And what you see for the first time is two classes regarding the seed of regarding who would be heirs of the promise. One is the seed of the bondwoman. One is the seed of the free, representing the wise and the foolish, the wheat and the tares, and so on and so forth. And we see 5 years later, Isaac is weaned. He comes to maturity, representing the completion of the covenanting process for this group of people that is being tested in this time period, which is the priest. But at the very same time, we see that Ishmael mocks or persecutes Isaac at this point, and he is cast out, showing that the tares or the seed of the bondwoman will not be heirs of the promises of the covenant. They are separated, and this separation process, this line marks it as a point in time here at midnight. But the separation process is complete by the time you come to midnight. Okay, so we have this this line. So we have two classes. We see two classes at the prediction before midnight. We looked at the Last Supper, where we see Christ giving a prediction about the work of Judas. And Judas, he rebels at that point. So we see a rebellion at the prediction before midnight. And we talked about Justinian's decree that in 533, 5 years before 538, Justinian introduced a decree that declared the Pope the corrector of heretics. And this decree, by its very nature, its character, was a violation of the principles of separation of church and state. Right? So it gave the Pope power to use the civil apparatus, the army, the police, and so on, to deal with radical religious elements, or those that considered radical religious elements. So there's a law that is coming into the Congress of the United States at the prediction before midnight. That's one of the things that the events that we're looking to see, to know that we have reached this waymark in its fullest sense. And this law will be, in its very nature, a violation of the principles of separation of church and state. And how laws are passed, like if you look at Obamacare, Obama's healthcare plan, it was introduced, wasn't it? Right. But it wasn't passed overnight, was it? It was actually years. It was years. It was in the news. What was being debated, and was going back and forth before it finally got passed. Right. So there's that time period. So this decree is introduced at the prediction before midnight. But when it's passed and goes into effect at midnight, 5 years later, which brings you to 538. 538 is when the papacy began to persecute. But what do we see? We see that the decree gave the papacy power to address the Arian heresy, right? But those powers that was given to address the Arians, who was it used to deal with in 538? Are you following? All right, 533, the papacy was given power. He was declared the corrector of heretics. He was given broad powers. And these powers, why did Justinian give him these powers? Because he wanted to destroy the influence, to crush the Arian heresy, right? Because Justinian was a Catholic and the Arians were in opposition to the Catholic Church. So he gave the Pope power in 533 in this decree that he introduced. He gave it to the Pope to deal with the Arians. Are you following? But in 538, when the decree went into effect, it wasn't just the Arians the papacy was dealing with. Who was he using those powers against? Christians. Right? So we're going to see a similar development where when you look at the Arians, a prominent Arian kingdom were the Vandals, and you can show the Vandals are a symbol of Islam. Right? Their warfare was against the ships and commerce of Rome, and Islam, you can show as a prophetic symbol, is similar. Islam brings down the world economy. So you have this decree is introduced to deal with Islam. Right? That is the motivation. There's some activity of Islam that's going to take place that will lead to the development and the introduction of this decree. And the motivation will be to deal with radical Islam. Just as at 9/11, the Patriot Act, the motivation was to deal with radical Islam, right? But when this decree goes into effect, the powers that the apostate Protestants will be given, those powers are not just going to be used to deal with Islam only, right? They're going to be used to deal with who else? Right, with the priests, right? So we see in this history, and we made a suggestion that when you look at the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 years old, minimum, to be a member of the House of Representatives. To be a member of the Senate, you have to be 30 years old. And one of the common routes by which legislation is introduced and passed is it goes initially, it is passed in the House of Representatives, and then the Senate, right? So the suggestion is that at the prediction before midnight, you'll see the House of Representatives, which my brother has said would be at the forefront of pushing for the Sunday law in any case. But it's introduced here at the prediction before midnight, and it's eventually passed and becomes law at midnight. And then we see when this law starts being utilized and implemented, this is when we mark the beginning of, this is when we see persecution beginning in earnest upon the priests. So that's a development that is still yet future. So we looked at all this, and just looking at it, we see prediction. There was a prediction in 2014. There were two classes in 2014. A rebellion and a falling away. We've spoken at length about how that was manifested in 2014. So we see the way this was reconciled, right, is through the principle of progression that is embedded within the DNA of prophecy. We looked at the second angel's message, where Spirit of Prophecy clearly lays out that although Revelation 14:8, the text is giving you like a snapshot, right? A snapshot of a full development. Right? It's like taking a picture of a flower. But that flower didn't just appear as a flower, did it? Right? That's not how flowers develop, do they? They start from a seed, and then they grow progressively and progressively and progressively. That progression is not identified within the text of Scripture, but it's something that we must, as students of prophecy, read into our understanding, or we have to, if we're going to correctly interpret prophecy, read it into our understanding of what the Bible is teaching. That's why there's no contradiction when you read the text of Revelation 14:8, and it's identifying a worldwide development, and then we say April 19, this is when the second angel arrived. Right? There's no contradiction. The second angel verily did arrive here, but what happened in April 19 wasn't the full development. There's a progressive development of that principle until its full manifestation, which is what is summarily described in the text of the verse. Right? So, when we take this concept, and this should also help us to clarify our understanding of type and anti-type, or perfect and imperfect fulfillments. Right? Because it's through a wrong understanding of this concept that is leading many people astray. Because some people they're taking the events described in 9/11 and they are saying, when you read the text of Revelation 18, those things didn't happen. You don't see a worldwide development of a message going forth. You don't see that at 9/11. So 9/11 is an imperfect fulfillment, right? And then, the perfect fulfillment is put somewhere else, midnight or the Sunday law, right? And that's wrong, because from that they rest the foundation and all the developments under the second angel, the work of organization. They draw license to take all these developments and push them forward to midnight or Sunday law, wherever they say that perfect fulfillment is. And that will lead you astray, because if you push all those developments into the future, you are unable to understand the very work that you should be doing at this time. And so just a small misunderstanding like that of a concept can have very dire consequences. So when we look at Revelation 18, it verily arrived at 9/11. It did. And it was perfect. Right? It was perfect in its arrival at 9/11. But the principle must develop. Right? It arrived at 9/11, but the principle is developing until the full manifestation of the loud cry at the Sunday law. Same thing with the second angel. On April 19, 1844, the message arrived, and it was perfect. Even though you don't see a worldwide development in 1844, it was perfect. The principle had to develop. And we as students of prophecy are required to identify and trace the development of the principle. And this is what Adventists fail to do. Which is why many of them, because they read it, the text as is like that, then they say, well, this must be future. A lot of people do that. I mean, that's a very common development. A lot of these developments, messages, and so on, they're being put in the future. The tests are being put in the future because they're expecting they're expecting a full manifestation of the principle when it arrives. Does that make sense? But by the time you actually see the Sunday law described by the third angel, right? Adventists are saying, okay, by the time you actually see the Sunday law, it's too late. Do you get what I'm saying? Right? The Sunday law arrives way before, and you have to develop with that principle. You have to develop with that. You have to identify that principle, and you have to walk with it and develop with it. When you see the full manifestation, that is the end of that test, so to speak, and not the beginning of it. Okay, so we take this principle and we place it here. So identifying 2014 to the prediction before midnight as a progressive development, what does that tell us about where we are now? It says, so this is 2014, right? That would mean that maybe in this continuum, we are like here. So I'll put here, this is us. With the history of the prediction before midnight. And that has solemn and important implications for us when we consider a few things. It has important implications for us when we consider a few things. When we look at Judas, right, Judas, we see a rebellion at the prediction before midnight, leading 11 disciples before Christ is seized at midnight, before he's bound, representing the binding off of the wise priest. So we place this rebellion here. But let's look further at what happened to Judas. What does Spirit of Prophecy say about Judas when he left the table and went out? He says what? Says another spirit took control of him, right? Judas he becomes fully demon possessed. You understand? Maybe there was some wrestling that was happening. He was wrestling with his demons, before. But when it comes to this point, he's fully demon possessed, and he leaves, and it says it was night. It was night. He goes into complete darkness. And does he ever return? No. Right? And what does he do? He goes and hangs himself on what? A tree. What type of tree? What type of tree? Let's just look at it. What was the condition of the tree on which Judas hung himself? Or maybe it's in the Spirit of Prophecy. The scriptures just say he hanged himself, but there's specific detail. If I don't have the quote, I won't say it. But in any case, he goes and hangs himself. And when you hang yourself, when you hang yourself, you're cursed. Cursed is he that hangeth on a tree. Right? So Judas here, he is completely demon possessed. He goes into complete darkness, never to return, never to repent. And this final fate is he's cursed. He receives the mark of the beast. And the only thing he typifies the people who come to a place where the only thing that they're looking forward to, and they have a knowledge of it, they know that they're lost. And the only thing they have to look forward to is the 7 last plagues and the second death. Right? That is the curse. But now, Judas' rebellion and falling away. When we take those developments and identify them as beginning here in 2014, what does that say? It's saying that in this shaking that began in 2014, in this falling away, those that are falling away, that have fallen away and are falling away, because the shaking is continuing, they're coming under the full control of Satan. Right? They're demon-possessed. And they're departing never to repent, never to return to the truth. And their final fate is they're going to be hanged, and cursed is he that hangeth on a tree. They're going to close their probation on the wrong side of the great controversy. And they're going to be lost for all eternity. And like Judas, they're going to have the terror of the personal knowledge that they are lost. Right? So that's a really fearful development when you start to think about what these lines are saying about this history that began in 2014 and the events that we are living through at this time. So, as my brother has been saying, what we need now is really to pray and search our hearts that we don't repeat the history of Judas. What did Judas do? Because I find it interesting that Judas and John were the same in a fundamental sense. They had serious defects of character, right? The difference between the two was how they responded to Christ's messages to them. How they responded to the convictions of the Spirit and the truths that Christ was sending them. That's what made all the difference. John learned the lessons and he strove against himself to divest himself, right, of those defects of character that were revealed to him. He strove to bring his life, his habits, his character, his conduct, to discipline his thoughts and bring them in conformity to the will of God. Now Judas had the same opportunities, he received the same messages, he received the same convicting power of the Spirit. But with him, he held on. You understand? And there are things that a lot of the time we hold on to. You're convicted, and no one needs to tell you where it is that you are not right with the Lord. Because a lot of the time we know just what we're holding on to. And that is the difference, right? Judas, he held on. But there comes a point of no return. You understand? That's what we need to realize. Probation does not continue forever. The Spirit shall not always strive with men. So we are living in the history of the falling away. And I think for many of us there is opportunity in the remaining hours of probation to make right, to make sure our experience is right with the Lord, that we not be among those who repeat the history of Judas. Let's look at another line that makes the same point. If you turn to Genesis 14. Read verses 6 to 13, and it says, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. So this is the story of the butler and the baker. And we're saying what we're going to see clearly is that this is an illustration of the prediction before midnight, along with midnight. It says, verse 7, and he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me then, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner, when thou wast his butler. So there's the prediction that is put in place. That's a prediction, is it not?
Yes.
The prediction about the butler, that in how many days? In 3 days he shall be lifted up. I'm saying this is the prediction before midnight. Joseph is giving a prediction regarding the fate of the butler. Now we come to the baker. Let's read verses 16 to 22. It says, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh. And the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree. And the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler, and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted him. So there's a prediction given about the baker as well. So you see they represent 2 classes, right? The baker, he's told that within 3 days, you'll be hanged. And cursed is he that hangeth on a tree, just as Judas was hanged. So these 3 days, when we look at the binding off of the priests, according to Daniel, Daniel is touched 3 times after his Mari vision with Christ. So the number 3, those 3 touches represent the binding off of the 3 steps in the binding off of the priests. Right? The tares are bound first, we are told in the parable of the wheat and tares. So this history here, we're seeing the binding of the tares. Okay, and by the time we come to midnight, we see the separation of the 2 classes. Okay, so I mean, I have notes here on the symbolism of all the things that are being said there. You know, the 3 branches that brought forth ripe grapes and so on. You can see the latter rain in there and all that. But the point I want to make is that here, when the prediction was given, was it possible for the fate of the 2 to change? Once the prediction was given, their fate was sealed, right? this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. So, and this led us to an important consideration, because we've taught up to this point that midnight, the shut door, your fate is sealed. But what we're seeing in earnest is that although the door has not shut, your fate is sealed beforehand. You settle into your character, and you say, when you become settled into your character, your fate is essentially determined before that judgment is actually executed. Do you understand? So, when we take this dynamic and place it here, what is that telling us? If you put it in your own language, I understand. What is that saying about what has been taking place since 2014? People are sealing their eternal destinies. Right? People are sealing their eternal destinies. Which is what I'm saying. We imagine the close of probation as something spectacular, right? That you wake up one day and there's a big thing happening in the news, and and the whole church will know, right? We have all these imaginings about what the close of probation looks like. And remember what I said, the close of probation is what? It's frighteningly normal. Probation's been closing, people have been closing their probation, in essence, fundamentally, since 2014, in this falling away, based on how they're responding to the truth, based on how they're responding to these messages. They're sealing their eternal destinies, if one be more accurate in terms of how that is expressed. Because although the judgment was only executed here, it was all done by here. Right? Then there's just a period of time elapsing when really there's just a manifestation of a period of time which God allows things to play out until that final execution at midnight. Okay, so I want us to lay some thoughts now. My brother and I didn't really consult as to what we were going to share, so there's been a lot of overlap, which is good. But I'd just like us to share some lines that he has already spoken to them somewhat on 2014. On 2014. There are other ways by which we can identify the prophetic significance of 2014 other than just by seeing that the events described here literally happened here. When we look at the 2520, when does the 2520 begin? When? 723, right? But before that, there's a proclamation of the prophecy where, yes, it's set forth in Leviticus, but there was a prophet who actually identified that, within a set period of time, the 2520 is going to begin. Isaiah. What chapter?
7.
Is that chapter 8, isn't it?
7.
Is that chapter 7? Okay. And what year did he give this? 742. So we have how many years from 742 to 723? So we have 19 years before the northern tribes are scattered, and then 46 years before the southern tribes are scattered in 677, right? And when we come to the end of the prophecy, at the end of the 25-20 for the northern tribes, that ends in 1798. And the 25-20 for the southern tribes ends in 1844. So we have 46 years. But what we see within the 25-20 is a chiastic structure, where when we look at a chiasm, we see it starts at one point, it reaches an apex, and ends at the point where it started. So when we look at the 25-20, we see that there's a chiastic structure within it where the end parallels the beginning. You have 1946 and you have 46 and 19. Sorry, this diagram is not very good. And of course, we mark that in 742. What do we see taking place with Isaiah? The 25-20 is unsealed, in a sense, in that Isaiah is proclaiming its beginning, right? There was a civil war between the north and the south, between Ephraim and Judah. And in this civil war between Ephraim and Judah, and in this civil war, the south was actually called the Confederacy. So we see this chiastic structure within the 25-20 where the end parallels the beginning, right? So now when we look at the book of Daniel, chapter 4, was it chapter 5? Belshazzar, chapter 5. We see the handwriting on the wall. It's Mene, Tekel Upharsin. And we've used this to derive a symbol of the 25-20. A mene is how many shekels? How many? 50, right? A mene is 50 shekels. 50 shekels. A tekel is 1 shekel. And the Upharsin is half a mene, so that would be 25 shekels. So this gives you 126. But the Bible says a gera is 20 shekels. So if you multiply 126 by 20, that gives you 25-20. So you see that 25-20 is identifying the scattering of Babylon and Belshazzar. Right? The 25-20 is identifying the scattering of the kingdom. So when David, he just saw the figures, he understood the symbolic significance of it. But 126 then becomes for us a symbol of the 25-20. So, yes? No? Okay. 126 becomes a symbol of the 25-20. And what is the characteristic of the 25-20? What is embedded within the DNA of the 25-20? The chiastic structure, this principle that its end parallels its beginning, right? So, when we look at 1888, for example, do you have another one? What happened in 1863? We see a rejection of foundational truth, right? There's a rejection of foundational truth, isn't it? And we can look at what led to that rejection of foundational truth. We could, James White, he was no longer using Miller's rules. If you read his study where he's going back on the 25-20, he was using the what? He was using principles of the historical grammatical method, essentially. He was using the methodology that incorporated Greek principles of interpretation. So, and we call that mingling of the worldly with the holy, the mystery of iniquity. But essentially, you have an issue with methodology. There's an incorrect methodology that is being used, an unbiblical methodology that is being used to reject foundational truth. So you have the rejection of foundational truth, but you also have the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1863. But if you count 126 years from 1863, that takes you to 2014. And what did we say about 126? Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. Oh, sorry, okay. Thank you, you're more awake than me. We'll come to this. Let me just remember the points that we made here. 1888 is what I was looking for. When you add 126 from 1888, that brings you to 2014. Right. Now, what happened in 1888? You have a rejection of the latter rain. There's a rejection of the latter rain. There's not only a rejection of what else, there's a rejection of the latter rain, there's a rejection of what else? Because it wasn't just Jones and Waggoner standing there. It was Jones and Waggoner giving this message, and then the prophet standing right next to them saying, this message these guys are saying is the truth. Right? So when they were rejecting Jones and Waggoner, they weren't just rejecting the latter rain, they were rejecting what else? The spirit of prophecy. The rejection of the latter rain, the rejection of the spirit of prophecy. Let's read a passage in notes from page 23. Speaking of this, it says from 3 MR page 191. The quote on page 23, 3 MR page 191. And it says, when I purposed to leave Minneapolis, this is in 1888, the Minneapolis General Conference, where Jones and Waggoner gave the message of righteousness by faith. When I purposed to leave Minneapolis, the angel of the Lord stood by me and said, not so, God has a work for you to do in this place. The people are acting over the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Okay, so 1888, you have the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram being repeated, right? So KDA, that's Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And if you read Patriarchs and Prophets, what does it say Korah, Dathan, and Abiram's issue was? It was a rebellion against the established leadership. Does it rebellion against the established leadership. But what motivated that rebellion? What was in Korah, Dathan, and Abiram's hearts? Beg your pardon?
All of them are holy.
That's the argument. That's the argument that they presented. But what motivated them was what motivated Satan in heaven. Jealousy, right? So it's interesting that we can't peer into men's hearts, can we? But when you see people fulfilling certain prophetic roles, the Bible is telling you what is in their heart. Do you get it? Right. So this rebellion is motivated by jealousy. And she says in 1888 they were going over the repeating the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And we'll come to the specific argument Korah, Dathan, and Abiram presented. When you go back to that passage on page 23, it says, I have placed you in your proper position, which those who are not in the light will not acknowledge. They will not heed your testimony, but I will be with you. My grace and power shall sustain you. It is not you they are despising, but the messengers and the message I sent to my people. They have shown contempt for the word of the Lord. Satan has blinded their eyes and perverted their judgment. And unless every soul shall repent of this their sin, this unsanctified independence that is doing insult to the Spirit of God, they will walk in darkness. So there is an unsanctified independence, not wanting to be subject to the appointed leadership and instrumentalities that God had put in place. Right? That's what motivated Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. But you also see she's saying that's what was happening in 1888. There's an unsanctified independence. And she says, I will remove the candlestick out of his place, except they repent and be converted, that I should heal them. They have obscured their spiritual eyesight. They would not that God should manifest his Spirit and his power. So what are they rejecting? The Holy Spirit. For they have a spirit of mockery and disgust at my word. Lightness, trifling, jesting, and joking are daily practiced. They have not set their hearts to seek me. They walk in the sparks of their own kindling, and unless they repent, they shall lie down in sorrow. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye at your point of duty, for I am with thee, and will not leave thee nor forsake thee. These words from God I have not dared disregard. So you take 126 from 1888, it brings you to 2014. So what does that say? 2014, what took place and what we saw was a rejection of foundational truths, right? A rejection of foundational principles and concepts of this message. I remember, because I used to work with them quite extensively, one of the leading preachers from one of the ministries that fell away. And I was going back and forth with him in an email, trying to reason with him and make sense of the position that he was taking. And I was telling him that, listen, the lines are clear. Thinking that this whole time we all believed the line. We all understood the biblical basis of the methodology of prophetic line upon prophetic line. No, listen, you know what? The lines don't trump the Bible. You understand the argument? Saying that the lines cannot be used to contradict a plain reading of the Bible. But realize that is a rejection, right? That is a rejection of the foundational principle behind this message. And there's no contradiction between the Bible and the methodology, you understand? But in order to reject the conclusions that were being presented, they reverted back to the Adventist and apostate Protestant way of reading the Bible, which is just to read it at face value. You know what I mean? Rather than applying the specific methodologies and modalities that God has provided within the Word itself. Right, so you see, There was a rejection of foundational truth that took place. And this rebellion, and this rebellion was a repetition of the history of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, they presented an argument to Moses. And that argument was, look, all the people are holy. The entire congregation is holy, and God is in them and He's them. Why are you putting yourself in a position of leadership over us, seeing the whole congregation is holy? Right? That was their argument. Right? That was the very argument brought forth in 2014. Saying, listen, God is using all these ministries. God is using all of us. Who is FFA and who is Jeff Pippinger to come to correct us? Because that was what started the issue. Right? It was a refusal to receive correction on various points of doctrine. Okay. These guys were going around the world teaching that, Joel is talking about Joel's 4 insects, that is Islam, Day of the Lord is 9/11, and so on and so forth. And when challenged on these with correction, they would not receive correction. Right? Who are you to be the corrector of us? And they actually used to call him names. They used to call him the corrector of heretics. Right? So you have the repetition of the history of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, which is motivated by jealousy, a unsanctified independence, and we see the very arguments presented by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram being repeated here in 2014. And what were they rejecting? They were rejecting the latter rain. They were rejecting the latter rain. Sorry, the rejection of foundational truth is here. We're coming to that. But here they rejected the latter rain. The latter rain started falling in 2014 in the messages of Ezra 7:9. And those were rejected by the same camp that fell into this group here. Right. So when we look at 2014, we have this line as a witness to its prophetic significance. It's specifically identified in the prophetic narrative as a waymark where we see a falling away, a repetition of the history of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, a rejection of the latter rain, a rejection of God's appointed instrumentalities for the leadership of His work. So, Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, we come back to this. A mene is 50 shekels. But depending on where you are, Babylon or Israel, and what period of history, they're different measurements for that constitute a mene. One is 50, and another is actually 60. A mene can be 60 shekels. And this one's actually identified in the Bible. Do we know the verse? Ezekiel? Ezekiel 45 verse? Ezekiel 45 verse 12. It says, and the shekel shall be 20 gerahs, 20 shekels, 5 and 20 shekels. Ezekiel 45 verse 12. Yeah. 20 shekels, 5 and 20 shekels, 15 shekels shall be your mene. So if you add that up, that comes up to 60. Right? So a mene can be 60 shekels. So we have mene 60, mene 60, tekel 1, and the upharsin is half a mene. Right? So the upharsin is 30. When you add 60 plus 60 plus 30, what does that give you? Gives you 150, 1. So when you come to 1863, and you add 151 to 1863, it brings it to 2014. So 151 also becomes a symbol of the 2520. And again, within the 2520 is embedded the concept that the end parallels the beginning. And in 1863, we see a rejection of foundational truth. As we've already discussed, that's what happened in 2014. But we also see organization. 2014, organization becomes present truth, right? Based on what we were seeing in 1863. So this is another witness that 2014 it's a waymark that we can identify as the beginning of this time period. That is the time of the prediction before midnight. You know, I think I'll pause there. We've covered a lot of ground, right? Again, just as with our last study, we've been looking to clarify the relationship, to clarify understanding of really what has been going on in this time in which we're living. And it's quite solemn and important. We're living in the history when God is bringing the work of probation for the priest to an end. Right? We are living through it in this time. All these histories, all the closes of probation illustrated throughout the Bible, they have force now. This is the time in which we're living. And this knowledge should lead us to think. Bible Christianity is not an emotional religion. It's a thinking religion. God is giving you knowledge. God knows that we are reasoning, thinking beings, right? And He's not giving you excitement, He's giving you knowledge. Right? Things that you need to think about and reason through. Right? And this knowledge should lead you to hopefully to think about where you are in your experience with Him. And it should lead you to make calm, reasoned decisions, right? About the course that you're going to pursue with regards to yourself and with regards to the broader work that God is calling us to. So that is what we've been seeking to clarify. In our next study, we're going to look at Herod's temple. That is the last of the three illustrations of the temple that we'll look at, and then we'll go to another subject, which is the prophetic justification for organization. We'll be looking at some very basic lines that, for those who've been in this movement, we're familiar with them. But we'll see that within those lines are very clear illustrations of what is taking place right now, what God is calling us to right now. Because, we're going to be challenged. You're going to be challenged within this movement by people who tell the Lord, by those people who you remember Ellen White's first vision. There's a pathway going up to the heavenly Canaan. Yeah. And the pathway was lit by what there was a light behind it that lit the pathway all the way up, right? What was that light? The midnight cry, like these truths. That's the light that lights our pathway all the way up to the heavenly Canaan. But as they were walking up, what would some say along the way? They were saying, God would not have led us out this far. And what do? They fall down to the wicked world below, while the others continue. Then they're less and less going up. So, in this movement, I was talking to my brother the other day that when we started looking at these Bible studies and looking at these truths, no one had any idea. We never imagined we'd be at a place where we'd be organizing another church. We never imagined we'd be at a place where we're saying there comes a point when we're actually going to have to call people out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We never imagined that. Right? When we first came, it was just an interesting Bible study. Right? But as you go up that pathway, right, God is leading you and you follow. Then there's some people who come and say, look, you know what? I've been following all this time, but this organization thing, God has not led us out this far. Right? And they fall down to the wicked world below. All along, there's been like, okay, I follow Daniel 11, 40, 45, but now this 25, 20 will be coming in balance. God has not led us out this far. Right? This 9/11 thing, Islam, and latter rain, I think this is now fanaticism. God has not led us out this far. So all along as we've been going up, there have been people following. Now this thing of organization, this has been, it's a serious test. It's a serious test, and many people are giving that, and they're saying, God has not led us out this far. And they're going to present you with arguments, people within this movement, and you're going to have to be grounded in yourself to know the prophetic justification for why you are doing what you're doing and why you are participating in this work. You'll be challenged also by your Adventist brethren abroad. Don't you know that the ship is sailing through? Right? She says the ship is going to sail through, so what are you doing? You know? And you have to know within yourself, you know, well-reasoned arguments from the scriptures for why you are pursuing the course that we are. There are many. I just want to lay out a few in our next study, along with a wrapping up of this study of the rearing of the temple. But for now, we can close with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. Lord, we thank you for your goodness toward us. Lord, it is a good thing to be here. And Lord, from eternity, you saw these meetings and you saw everyone in this room, dear Lord. And you saw souls, Lord, in the valley of decision. Each soul must decide, Lord, either for the truth or for against it. It is our prayer that all in this room, in the capacity, Lord, that you've given them, will decide for the truth. Will decide for John and not Judas in the experience that they choose to have with you. Father, our prayer is we believe. We ask that you may help our unbelief. Strengthen our faith, dear Lord, and guide our steps. That, Lord, in this crucial time, the closing hours of probation, we may set all things in order as it relates to our personal salvation, as it relates to our individual cases. And Lord, that we may be the instruments for the saving of others, our households, our friends, our brethren of the faith. Please bless us now as we break, and please bless the proceedings of the rest of the day. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.